For a long time now, it has seemed that Russia and China are really close and pursue many mutual interests, such as, for example, dismantling the Western-centric world model. In the 1950s, there was even a famous slogan, "Russian and Chinese are brothers forever," which came from a song that was written in honor of Mao Zedong's first visit to Moscow. So how close are Russia and China today?
I am glad to seize this opportunity to address the friendly Chinese people in one of the largest and most authoritative world media in advance of the state visit of President of the People's Republic of China Xi Jinping to Russia.
These were the opening words of Vladimir Putin's article, which he published in the Chinese state-owned People's Daily newspaper in March. Xi Jinping published a largely reciprocal article. Aside from mutual compliments, here are some important figures to look at. In 2022, the trade turnover between China and Russia totaled a record-breaking $190 billion. The trade turnover increased another 39% in the first quarter of this year compared to the same period last year. And lastly, Russian exports to China increased by more than 43% in 2022 compared to 2021. And that is taking into account that China was already Russia's top trading partner even before the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, while Vladimir Putin is fighting a very difficult war, Xi Jinping does not appear to be rushing to his allies' rescue, not militarily at least. Today we will examine the nature of the relationship between Russia and China and try to understand how close they really are. But first, a little history. In the 20th century, China and Russia, the Soviet Union then, grew especially close as the largest states to have undergone a communist revolution. Here is a quick breakdown of this mutual history by the US Council on Foreign Relations. In 1950, the PRC and the USSR signed a 30-year alliance treaty called the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance.
The Soviet Union supported China's efforts to develop nuclear weapons, provided the country with conventional arms, and sent Soviet academics and scientists to advise the Chinese government.
In the 1960s, the relations between two countries began to worsen, almost resulting in a war, when in 1969 the Chinese army attacked Soviet security personnel on contested river islands. One of the points of contention was the Soviet support of India, China's long-standing rival. In 1979, the treaty expired and the USSR and the PRC were no longer bound to each other. Only in 1989, relations improved with Mikhail Gorbachev making an official visit to Beijing, the first governmental visit between the two countries in 30 years. In the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia and China continued to strengthen their relations. In 2001, a new 20-year treaty was signed by the two countries titled Sino-Russian Treaty of Friendship. Putin and Xi extended the treaty by another 5 years when the initial term expired in February of 2022. Lastly, in 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the economic partnership between Russia and China strengthened while at the same time Beijing did not recognize the annexation. China also did not recognize Russia's new annexations in 2022, with Beijing's EU envoy Fu Zong even hinting at backing Ukraine in restoring its territorial integrity. With Russia's international isolation growing as a result of starting the largest war in Europe since World War II, the power dynamic between Moscow and Beijing shifted dramatically. If before 2022 they could have been cautiously called equal partners, now Russia is clearly becoming more and more economically dependent on China. However, China does not want Russia as a vassal state. The largest reason for that is, you guessed it, the war in Ukraine. China is in a very difficult position where increasing closeness with Russia now causes the EU and the US to decrease their economic closeness with China, maybe even leading to sanctions on Beijing in the future. The EU and America are China's largest trade partners, with Russia only in 10th place in 2022. China does not want to lose either as trading partners, but it would be hard to imagine that Beijing would favor the partner with which it has $190 billion worth of annual trade over the other two, the joint trade of which with China totals over $1.5 trillion. Moreover, the Chinese economy has been in decline in recent years, with experts saying that China's 40-year boom is over.
For decades, China powered its economy by investing in factories, skyscrapers, and roads. The model sparked an extraordinary period of growth that lifted China out of poverty and turned it into a global giant whose export prowess washed across the globe. Now the model is broken. What worked when China was playing catch-up makes less sense now that the country is drowning in debt and running out of things to build. Parts of China are saddled with underused bridges and airports, millions of apartments are unoccupied, returns on investments have sharply declined.
At the same time, China's annual growth dropped from the usual 8% to around 3%. Nowadays, China cannot afford taking such risky chances as fully siding with Russia and subsequently losing its trading partners in the West. At the same time, it cannot fully denounce Russia either, because due to Russia's economic state, China is able to purchase oil and coal from it and only a fraction of the market price. This is why China's stance on the war in Ukraine has been so ambiguous. Beijing does not have a working strategy for effectively juggling both Russia and the West. Russia is also not very keen on becoming a subservient state to China. After all, one of Putin's favorite words is sovereignty, and this is how emotional he got when talking about CIA agents working in the Kremlin in the 1990s.
В начале 2000-х я уже там вычистил всех, но в середине 90-х у нас в качестве советников, официальных сотрудников правительства Российской Федерации сидели, как позднее выяснилось, кадровые сотрудники Центрального разведуправления США.
Putin is very territorial, so it would be hard to imagine him leading the country into a state of economic dependence. The reality is he had nowhere else to go. It is hard to understand what he thought was going to happen when he invaded Ukraine, especially with President Biden warning him of the potential of new sanctions just 2 weeks before February 24th. In any case, Russia's dependence on China is nothing more than a measure of last resort and not so much a friendly gesture, especially taking into account that Russia also grew closer to India, China's sworn enemy. India, by the way, also wants to deter Russia from growing closer to China. The true nature of the Russia-China relationship could be summed up in one word: situational. The USSR and China grew close in the 1950s because China needed assistance in building its socialist society, while the USSR needed allies in the Cold War. The 2000 treaty was signed because China wanted to modernize their armed forces and obtain a stable source of affordable fuels, while Russia wanted to sell their military technologies and obtain sources of capital. And of course, they grew even closer in 2022 because Russia was facing international isolation while China was struggling economically, which could have been helped to an extent with cheap Russian fuels and other raw materials. China also uses Russia against the West, threatening to grow closer to Moscow, although, as we saw, that approach was not foolproof as China now more than ever needs to preserve its economic relations with the West. Additionally, Putin and Xi are close because they are very similar as leaders. They both transformed their governments into authoritarian dictatorships and both have a very abstract hatred of the West. They even use the same political methods, for example, bolstering nationalism, promoting an expansionist rhetoric, and trying to establish a cult of personality. Admittedly, Xi was more successful at it. Russia and China are close only when they happen to be pursuing similar goals, but these goals seem to be changing as we speak. Putin needs to not lose the war in Ukraine to remain in power, although even that is not a guarantee. while C needs to prevent the PRC's economic situation from worsening. These interests are steadily taking Russia and China in different directions politically. Russia needs to find ways to supply its military, which most likely was the reason for Kim Jong-un's recent visit. China is never going to openly support Russia militarily, regardless of how much money it can make doing so. The risk of losing its trade with the West or even getting sanctioned is much too high. Russia cannot help China's economy persevere, as its own economy is not in the best shape, and its size is much smaller compared to that of the EU and the US combined. Putin and Xi may be in the same boat, but they're paddling in different directions.